Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about the BRICS expansion. They look at the headlines, they see the summits, they hear about new members joining, and they assume this is essentially a diplomatic performance, a counterweight, a symbolic gesture from countries that resent American dominance but lack the coordination to actually challenge it. And on the surface, that interpretation makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? These nations have wildly different political systems, competing regional interests, and in some cases, active border disputes with each other. India and China can barely agree on where their own border runs, let alone coordinate a global financial restructuring. So the conventional analysis treats BRICS as theater, useful theater perhaps, ambitious theater, but theater nonetheless. Here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, this idea flipped the entire understanding of what is actually unfolding across 3 continents simultaneously. Because when the focus shifts away from the political rhetoric and toward the structural mechanics, a very different picture emerges. What the BRICS nations are constructing is not an alliance in the traditional sense. It is something far more specific, far more technical, and far more dangerous to the existing order. They are building what strategic analysts have begun calling a 3-front squeeze on the dollar system. Not an attack on the dollar, a squeeze. And the distinction matters enormously because squeezes don't require coordination. They don't require ideological alignment. They don't even require the participants to like each other. They only require each actor to pursue its own structural interests within a system that has begun to converge those interests around a single outcome. The question that emerges from this pattern is not whether the BRICS bloc can replace the dollar by 2027. That framing misses the actual mechanism entirely. The real question is why every single major economy outside the Western core has independently concluded that reducing dollar exposure has become a structural imperative rather than a strategic preference. And once that question gets asked properly, the answer reveals something that very few people in the financial press have been willing to articulate clearly. The dollar's dominance was never primarily about American economic strength. It was about the absence of alternatives. And the conditions that made alternatives impossible are dissolving one by one across multiple geographies at the same time. To understand why that matters so much, the analytical framework that needs to be introduced here is something that strategic theorists call systems decoupling under structural pressure. This is not a new concept. It has been studied for decades in the context of how interconnected economic systems begin to fragment when the costs of remaining integrated exceed the costs of separation. What makes the current moment historically distinctive is that all 3 of the structural pressures that drive systems decoupling are now operating simultaneously on the dollar system, and each pressure reinforces the others rather than canceling them out. The first pressure is what the framework identifies as weaponization fatigue. When a financial system gets used as an instrument of foreign policy enforcement, every nation that observes that enforcement begins calculating its own vulnerability. This is not a moral judgment about whether the enforcement was justified. It is a structural observation about how rational actors respond to demonstrated risk. After 2022, when Russian central bank reserves were frozen on a scale unprecedented in modern financial history, every treasury official in every non-aligned nation faced the same question. If our political relationship with Washington deteriorated, would our reserves be next? And the answer, for any honest assessment, was that the possibility could no longer be excluded. The second pressure is what the framework calls infrastructure substitution. For decades, the practical impossibility of conducting large-scale international trade outside the dollar system was not because the dollar was inherently superior. It was because the plumbing did not exist. SWIFT, correspondent banking networks, settlement systems, commodity pricing benchmarks, all of it was built around dollar denomination. Building parallel infrastructure required massive coordination, decades of investment, and the kind of patience that political cycles rarely permit. But infrastructure, once built, does not require constant rebuilding. It accumulates, and the parallel infrastructure has been quietly accumulating for 15 years, often beneath the threshold of Western media attention. The third pressure, and the one that ties the system together, is what analysts have begun referring to as the fiscal credibility erosion. The dollar's reserve status has historically depended on the perception that American fiscal management, while imperfect, would not threaten the long-term value of dollar-denominated assets. When the federal debt sits at $34 trillion and the trajectory points toward continued expansion, regardless of which party controls Washington, that perception begins to shift, not catastrophic catastrophically, not suddenly, but persistently. And persistent erosion in financial systems eventually produces tipping points that look obvious only in retrospect. What makes the three-front squeeze framework genuinely useful for understanding the current moment is that it explains why BRICS coordination does not need to be tight to be effective. Each nation acting in its own structural interest produces the same systemic outcome. China reduces dollar exposure to insulate itself from sanctions risk. Russia accelerates de-dollarization because it has already been excluded. India diversifies reserves because it watches the precedent. Brazil signs bilateral currency agreements because they reduce transaction costs. Saudi Arabia begins accepting yuan for oil because its strategic relationship with Washington has become conditional rather than guaranteed. None of these actors needs to coordinate with the others. They just need to each pursue their own logic, and the cumulative effect produces the squeeze. So let's go through exactly how this three-front squeeze is functioning in practice, because the architecture is actually three separate games running simultaneously, and each one deserves careful examination. The first front is the commodity trade front, and this is where the most consequential shifts have already occurred. For roughly 50 years, the global oil trade has been denominated almost exclusively in dollars. This was not accidental. The arrangement reached between Washington and Riyadh in the 1970s, often called the petrodollar system, ensured that any nation needing to purchase oil first needed to acquire dollars. This created structural global demand for the currency that had nothing to do with American economic productivity and everything to do with the architecture of energy markets. That arrangement has now begun to fragment in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. China and Saudi Arabia have conducted multiple oil transactions settled in yuan. Russia sells oil to India in rupees and dirhams. Iran has built an entire shadow trading system that operates outside dollar denomination by necessity. The volumes involved remain modest relative to the global oil trade, but the trajectory matters more than the current snapshot. Approximately 20% of global oil trade now occurs outside dollar denomination, up from essentially zero a decade ago, and every transaction completed outside the dollar system normalizes the alternative infrastructure for the next transaction. Here's where it gets particularly significant. Consider what happens when a major commodity exporter realizes that accepting payment in a non-dollar currency carries no meaningful penalty. The first transaction feels risky, the second feels less so. By the 100th transaction, the alternative settlement has become routine. And once it becomes routine, the structural justification for holding large dollar reserves begins to weaken. Why hold reserves in a currency you no longer need for your primary export sales? The question answers itself slowly across thousands of corporate treasury decisions made by entities that have no particular ideological position on the matter. The second front is the central bank reserve front. Here the data points become particularly striking. According to International Monetary Fund composition figures, the dollar's share of global reserves has declined from approximately 73% in 2001 to roughly 58% currently. That decline of 15 percentage points across 2 decades sounds gradual, but in the context of central bank reserve management, where institutional inertia is enormous, it represents a tectonic shift. Central banks do not change reserve composition lightly. They change it when their internal risk assessments tell them they must. Where has that displaced 15% gone? Some has flowed to the euro, some to the yen, some to sterling. But the most significant accumulation has been in gold. Central banks globally purchased approximately 1,000 metric tons of gold in 2023 alone, the highest annual figure since records began in this format. China has been adding to its gold reserves consistently for over a decade, now holding officially over 2,200 metric tons, with widespread analyst consensus that the actual figure is substantially higher. Russia accumulated gold aggressively in the years preceding 2022, which is why the reserve freeze, while painful, did not prove fatal to its financial system. Other nations watched and learned. Think about what happens when central banks systematically prefer gold to dollars over a sustained period. Gold does not generate interest. Gold requires physical storage. Gold is less liquid than treasury securities. The fact that central banks are accepting these inconveniences in order to hold less dollar exposure tells you everything about how their internal risk models have shifted. They are accepting real costs to reduce a risk they perceive as growing. And these are not ideologically motivated decisions. The Reserve Bank of India and the Banco Central do Brasil are not taking instructions from Beijing. They are looking at the same risk landscape and reaching similar conclusions independently. The third front is the bilateral settlement front, and this is where the parallel infrastructure becomes genuinely operational. China has signed currency swap agreements with over 40 nations, totaling more than $500 billion in capacity. The cross-border interbank payment system, often called CIPS, processed more than 14 trillion in transactions in 2023, a figure that would have seemed implausible just 5 years earlier. India has established rupee settlement mechanisms with Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and several African nations. Brazil and Argentina have explored regional settlement systems that bypass dollar intermediation entirely. Now consider a hypothetical scenario that illustrates how these systems function in practice. A Brazilian agricultural exporter sells soybeans to a Chinese food processor. Under the traditional system, the Brazilian seller would price in dollars, the Chinese buyer would acquire dollars to pay, both parties would absorb the transaction costs of dollar conversion, and both economies would maintain dollar reserves to facilitate similar future transactions. Under the emerging system, the transaction can be priced in real or yuan, settled directly between the central banks of the two nations, and completed without either party touching dollars at all. The transaction is faster, cheaper, and politically insulated from any future deterioration in either nation's relationship with Washington. Once a corporate treasurer experiences that workflow, the previous arrangement begins to feel anachronistic. Now layer on top of that the historical parallel that strategic analysts have been studying with renewed interest. The pound sterling did not lose its global reserve status through a single dramatic event. It lost it gradually, across roughly 4 decades from the early 20th century to the post-war settlement, through a cumulative process that looked manageable at every individual stage. Britain entered the First World War as the world's preeminent financial power, holding the position the United States holds today. The pound was the currency of global trade. The City of London was the financial capital of the world, and British government debt was the safest asset available. By 1945, none of those statements remained true. What broke the pound was not a single crisis. It was the accumulation of structural pressures that individually seemed manageable but collectively proved decisive. 2 world wars depleted reserves. The cost of maintaining global military presence exceeded the productive capacity to sustain it. Allied nations that had financed British war efforts demanded repayment in forms that drained sterling holdings. Colonial possessions began asserting economic independence. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 formalized what had already become apparent in market behavior, that the dollar had displaced sterling as the central reserve asset. But the displacement itself had occurred years earlier through the accumulated weight of structural shifts that British policymakers had identified as problems but proved unable to reverse. The lesson that emerges from that history is not that reserve currency transitions happen quickly. It is that they happen invisibly, in plain sight, while the existing system continues operating with sufficient functionality that observers underestimate the significance of what is occurring beneath the surface. Consider another scenario that brings the contemporary parallels into focus. Imagine a mid-sized economy, neither aligned with Washington nor explicitly opposed to it, conducting routine trade across multiple regions. 20 years ago, that economy held perhaps 70% of its reserves in dollars because no functional alternative existed at scale. Today, that same economy can hold perhaps 50% in dollars, 20% in euros, 10% in yuan, 10% in gold, and the remainder in a basket of other currencies. The diversification is not a political statement. It is a risk management decision that any prudent treasurer would make if the alternative infrastructure permitted it, and the alternative infrastructure now permits it, where it did not before. The third hypothetical worth considering involves what happens during a moment of acute geopolitical stress. Imagine a regional conflict that triggers Western sanctions against a non-Western actor. Under the previous system, the sanctions would cascade through the global financial system, forcing every bank, corporation, and government with any exposure to comply or face exclusion from dollar settlement. Under the emerging system, the sanctioned entity has functional alternatives. Trade continues, perhaps less efficiently, perhaps at higher cost, but it continues. And every observer of that continuation revises their assessment of how essential dollar access actually is to economic survival. Now add to this something that makes the current current moment particularly significant. The fiscal trajectory of the United States itself has begun generating its own structural pressures on dollar dominance. Federal debt service costs now exceed defense spending. The Congressional Budget Office projects continued debt expansion regardless of which party controls Washington. Every increment of additional debt service requirement reduces fiscal flexibility for the kind of counter-cyclical spending that has historically supported dollar credibility during global stress events. None of this means the dollar is on the verge of collapse. It means the structural foundation that supported dollar dominance is gradually weakening, even as the alternative infrastructure gradually strengthens. The two trends do not need to meet at any specific point to produce systemic transformation. They only need to continue. So what does this mean for the immediate tactical landscape facing the United States and its allies? The first set of consequences operates at the level of monetary policy autonomy. For decades, the dollar's reserve status allowed American policymakers extraordinary flexibility. Deficit spending could continue without triggering currency collapse because global demand for dollars absorbed the supply expansion. Interest rate decisions made in Washington could be calibrated primarily to domestic conditions because the dollar's reserve role insulated the currency from typical balance of payments pressures. As that reserve status erodes, even gradually, that flexibility begins to compress. American policymakers will increasingly find that decisions previously available to them carry costs that did not exist before. The second set of consequences extends to regional dynamics across multiple geographies simultaneously. In the Middle East, the gradual decoupling of oil pricing from exclusive dollar denomination changes the strategic calculations of every major energy producer. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and other Gulf states have spent decades calibrating their security relationships with Washington against the structural benefits of operating within the dollar system. As those structural benefits diminish, the security relationships must justify themselves on different terms. This does not mean those relationships will rupture. It means they will be renegotiated continuously rather than assumed as permanent features of the regional architecture. In Latin America, the emergence of bilateral settlement systems with China creates new options for governments that have historically operated within the dollar's gravitational pull. Brazil, Argentina, and increasingly Mexico can now conduct meaningful trade outside dollar intermediation, which expands their policy autonomy in ways that previous administrations could not have imagined. Each expansion of that autonomy reduces the influence that traditional financial pressure can exert on regional governance. African nations watching this pattern draw their own conclusions about which financial relationships offer the most flexibility for their own development trajectories. The third level of consequences operates at the global economic systems level, particularly with respect to commodity markets and capital flows. When commodity pricing fragments across multiple currency denominations, the pricing discovery mechanism itself becomes less unified. Arbitrage opportunities multiply, hedging strategies become more complex, trade financing requires new instruments. None of this is catastrophic, but all of it represents friction that did not previously exist, and friction in global trade systems does not remain constant. It tends to accumulate, generating its own pressure for either resolution through new institutional arrangements or further fragmentation. The fourth and most consequential level addresses how these accumulated pressures affect the underlying architecture of international order itself. The dollar system was never just a financial arrangement. It was the economic substrate that supported American military presence globally, that underwrote the alliance structures built after 1945, and that gave Washington the unique capacity to project both economic and security influence simultaneously. As that substrate erodes, the entire edifice that depends on it must adapt. This does not mean the alliance system collapses. It means the alliance system must increasingly justify itself on grounds other than the structural inevitability that previous generations assumed. The post-1945 order was built on a foundation that is now being quietly modified, and the consequences of that modification will play out across decades rather than years. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not a coordinated assault on the dollar by ideologically aligned adversaries. What you see is something more fundamental and more difficult to reverse. You see a global financial system whose participants have independently concluded that the costs of remaining fully integrated have begun to exceed the costs of partial decoupling. You see infrastructure being built not from grand strategic design, but from accumulated practical necessity. You see central banks making conservative risk management decisions that, in aggregate, produce systemic transformation that no single decision was meant to create. The real question is not whether the BRICS nations can dethrone the dollar by 2027. That framing assumes a binary outcome that the underlying dynamics do not actually produce. The question is whether the dollar system can adapt to a world in which its structural advantages have eroded sufficiently that alternatives have become functional, even if those alternatives remain individually less efficient. The question is whether American policymakers can recalibrate fiscal and monetary management to a world in which the previous flexibility no longer exists. The question is whether the alliance structures built on the dollar's foundation can find new justifications as that foundation modifies beneath them. None of these questions have predetermined answers, but the conditions that force the questions are assembling faster than the conditions that would allow comfortable avoidance. The next time you hear about another bilateral currency agreement, another central bank gold purchase, another commodity transaction settled outside the dollar system, try holding all of these things together in the same frame, because they're not separate stories. They're different angles on the same story. Reserve currencies do not fall overnight. They erode. And right now, the conditions for that erosion are assembling with remarkable consistency across 3 continents, 4 major economic blocs, and a financial architecture that took 7 decades to construct. What replaces it, if anything fully does, remains genuinely undetermined, but the assumption that nothing will replace it has become harder to defend with each passing quarter.